Go ahead and start the recording. Hi, everyone. Thank you all for being on Zoom tonight with us. This is our third weekly Wild Chat in the month of May. These are brought to you by Cacsadia Wildlands as part of our weekly programming to connect with our community and bring the issues that we most care about and most work on to our community during these times that feel really isolating during the COVID pandemic. My name is Sam. I am the grassroots organizer with Cacsadia right now. I'm for another week, currently transitioning out of this role. This is my last weekly Wild Chat with you all before Dylan Plummer takes over. Hey, Dylan. And I'm really excited tonight to be here because this is one of my favorite topics and issues that Cacsadia Wildlands works on, which is public lands timber sales. So the theme of tonight's discussion is timber sales and how to stop them. And we are going to be joined by three amazing panelists who work with Oregon-based organizations, Oregon Wild, BART, and the Klamath Siskiyou Wildlands Center. And I'm going to introduce each of them as we get into it. But before we do, just some quick housekeeping things. Importantly, if you are new to Zoom or just forgot, it is great to remember to go ahead and mute yourself if you are not a panelist and not speaking. That just helps everyone else hear you and cut down the background noise. If you have pressing questions and things that you want to bring up or share with the group, resources and things, you can use the chat feature, which is located at the bottom of your screen, or should be, and we can communicate that way. And you can also ask some questions, and hopefully we'll have a little bit of time at the end to go into some of the major ones at the end. Other than that, we're going to dive in, and I just want to give a little bit of context because a lot of times we take for granted the foundations of what it is that we're talking about when we're talking about public lands timber sales. And I know that for me, at least, when I moved out to Oregon from Florida, when I thought about the federal lands out in Oregon, I envisioned pristine, lush, old-growth forests, wild and scenic rivers, world-class outdoor recreation opportunities. And all of that is absolutely true, but obviously when I moved out here, I saw another story that was happening at the same time as the story of those beautiful things. And that story was a story of clear cutting and a story of denuded watersheds, of aerial spraying, and of lots and lots of logging trucks. So I quickly learned when I moved out here what many of you all know, which is that Oregon's federal public lands are a complex battleground of competing interests. And those interests are displayed in the ways that the forests are managed. Our federal lands are managed for clean water, for habitat and recreation, but also for timber revenue. And when the value of timber revenue wins out over values for things like conservation and recreation and community safety, then what we end up getting is destructive, irresponsible logging projects in the form of so-called public lands timber sales. And so when we're talking about timber sales, that's what we're talking about. And they can look like anything from thinning to clear-cut style management. And it really varies widely depending on the place, the watershed you're talking about, the purpose of the timber sale, and the management body responsible for implementing it. The good news is, in all of this, is that there is actually a public process through which timber sales are introduced, developed, and implemented. And that process allows regular folks like you and I to influence these destructive proposals if we so wish. This is known as the NEPA process. Many of you are aware of it. And this NEPA process is what these three amazing panelists who are here with us this evening often use as a tool to successfully fight harmful logging projects. So without further ado, I want to introduce our first panelist who's going to dig into a little bit more of what the NEPA process is, the history, and how it's used. Chandra LeGue with Oregon Wild is the Western Oregon field coordinator there. Since 2003, she has been collaborating with conservation groups, federal land managers, and local stakeholders to promote Oregon Wild's vision for Oregon's public forest lands. And she also recently published an amazing book called Hiking Oregon's Ancient Forests. Super happy to have you here today. Hi, Chandra. Could you talk to us a little bit about what does NEPA stand for, and what is it? What is this thing that we're talking about?
Absolutely. Well, I'm going to share my screen because I have a couple of slides. Give me a second. So thanks for that. Thanks for having me here. And as you said, there's so much to talk about when we're talking about NEPA. So I might talk a little fast trying to answer these questions, but it's really important stuff. And so sorry, I just have my contact information up here right now in case anybody wants to get a hold of me. And also this groovy picture, that's not me because I figured you could see my face, but that's my colleague Doug Hyken at Oregon Wild, and of course Josh with, and that was when we were out looking at a public land timber sale sometime in the past. I've been doing this work for about 16 years. And also, since I'm talking, can I, there's somebody who's not on mute and I can just hear voices. So if you can make sure to mute yourself, that'd be great. So what are we talking about when we're talking about NEPA? Well, first, there's actually a lot of different laws that apply to our federal public lands. And so I want to start with that very briefly because it's important in the context of NEPA. There's protective laws like the Wilderness Act and the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act, and laws that are in place to protect species like the Endangered Species Act. And then there's these overarching sort of management plan acts that apply to our federal agencies. And then there's also policies like management plans for our national forests and for the BLM, and rules like the roadless rule that protects wild places across the country on national forest lands. And so in order to do any of these timber sales, the federal agencies are having to look at all of these laws and policies and making sure that they're in compliance with those. But then kind of serving as an umbrella over all of those, and a sort of the thing that's really going to check things off, make sure that they're following these laws and policies, is NEPA. So you can kind of think of it as this umbrella law that, and like I said, ensures that those other things are being met. So NEPA stands for the National Environmental Policy Act. It was passed back in 1970, so sort of at the birth of the environmental, movements and awareness of the fact that we were killing our natural world and that we might want to take some proactive measures. And it's been around ever since. So, and this is something that maybe other panelists will get into, and we can address in the questions. It's been eroded significantly, and especially in recent years. But it's nevertheless still very important. So in essence, it requires the federal agencies that manage our land to take a hard look at environmental consequences of any proposed activity like a timber sale that's going to happen on public land, and to document those consequences and analyze them before making a decision to move forward. So it's really important for that they are taking a look at whether there's going to be on the ground disturbances that say impact an endangered species, or have some unintended consequences like killing salmon. That said, that's all in theory, and sometimes the agencies don't do a very good job of this, but again, that's something to get into down the road. So a lot of the things we think about as NEPA are in this actual statute that was passed in 1970, but there's also tons and tons of detail that comes out of regulations developed by another federal agency, the Council on Environmental Quality, or CEQ, and regulations that the agencies themselves, or guidelines, I guess, that the agencies themselves develop, a handbook on how to implement NEPA. So NEPA is actually a pretty short law. But then all these regulations and guidelines that we're probably all going to talk about really come down into the nitty-gritty sort of documents that the agencies have to follow that's not actually in the 1970 law. This law is super important, not only because of the impacts for the environment, but because it's super democratic. It actually offers the public, in fact, requires that the public has an opportunity to weigh in, and that the federal agencies consider what the public has to say. We think that a timber sale will have negative impacts on an endangered stream. We have an opportunity to voice that opinion, offer research and science to back up our opinion, and they need to consider that before they move forward. So super important for concerned citizens, organized organizations like Cacsadia and Oregon Wild and BARC and KS Wild. And in general, we use it a lot. I would say every single day of our work.
Thank you for that, Chandra. That was a really great overview. Just a reminder for folks who just joined, please go ahead and mute your sound. We can hear a lot of rustling in the background. So building off of that, that great overview of what the NEPA process is, can you give us a little more of a play-by-play of how it actually works when it comes to the timber sale process from introduction to inception of a sale?
Yeah, and that is exactly what it is. It is a process. I've built some mean-looking flowcharts over the years to help myself and my colleagues wrap their heads around what that process is, and I'm not going to share those mean flowcharts with you today. I'll try to keep it simple. But I have this slide here because I wanted to put in context that even though there's this is an important law that we all get to weigh in via, and there's a long process, it still means that there's a lot of logging going on. So a lot of things go through this process we're about to talk about, and a lot of concerns are raised by the public and by organizations like ours, but we're still logging 600 million board feet of timber from our public lands every year. So there might be something broken with the system. So from start to finish, really, it starts with the federal agency determining that they want to do something. So we're talking about timber sales. They decide that they want to plan a timber sale in a certain area. And so they put together a team. They're called interdisciplinary teams of various Forest Service or BLM employees, staff people who have expertise in wildlife biology or fish biology, fuels and fire experts, foresters who are interested in figuring out how much timber can come out of an area. And they meet pretty early on in this process and figure out what they're going to propose. And one of the things they determine is what level of analysis they're going to do. And that's based on all these rules and guidelines that have been developed around NEPA and can go in sort of 3 different alternative pathways. So if a project's not going to, falls within a certain category, it's a categorical exclusion. And in theory, that means it's not going to have any significant impacts on the ground and should just kind of sail through an easy breezy process. Unfortunately, we've seen that these categories have been expanded to allow for a lot of pretty damaging activities to sail through in this easy breezy way when we don't really think they should. But essentially, a categorical exclusion gets just a small analysis that allows it to move forward. The next level is an environmental assessment, and that's other projects that might have more impact or are a larger scale. And so the agency has to determine whether they want to go through down that pathway and really do a more in-depth analysis that has more public process and will take a little bit longer. And then sort of the big kahuna is if it's going to have significant impacts, then they do an EIS, an environmental impact statement. And they really try to reserve that for the biggest, most damaging projects because they take a long time, they're expensive to go through, they have more public comment and hoops to jump through. Flat Country, for example, is a project on the Willamette National Forest that Cacsadia and others have been working on that is going through the EIS process. So they determine which pathway they're going to go down. They kind of kick off the project and tell the public about it. And that's where the next process starts, which is where we get a chance to weigh in on what the plan is. I bet a lot of you out there have written comments on timber sales, either through clicking on an action alert that's come through from one of the organizations you follow, like Cacsadia, or just on your own because you're a super awesome activist. And that's participating in the public part of NEPA. So first, there's the scoping comments. So that's when the agency gives us just like a little bit of a sneak peek of what they're planning, and it's an opportunity for the public to just kind of put out there on the table what we want them to consider as they move forward. And from there, the agency takes those comments and they work on their analysis. They kind of go through the steps of analyzing all the impacts to the environment and come back with a draft of their proposal, if it's going to be an EA or an EIS. From there, there's another comment period where the public gets to weigh in on that draft EA or EIS. So we have a lot more information. We have maps and units, and you know the things are the types of logging that they might be proposing to do, and so that's kind of when we, it's a good time to go and do ground truthing or something like that. We have another opportunity to weigh in during that period before the agency then issues a draft decision or their final EIS, depending on what track it's on. Then if it's on the Forest Service, there's an opportunity for the public to object to the draft decision. If people object, then the agency has to try to resolve the objection. I'm using all the technical terms here. They have to seek resolution. Doesn't mean they have to change anything, but they're supposed to address the concerns raised in the objection before they issue a decision which would move forward the timber sale. If this is on BLM land, it's just a slightly different process and different words, but essentially then if they issue a decision on a timber sale, you get a chance to protest it. If they say, nah, we're gonna deny that, you get a chance to appeal it. So there's a couple different steps of before moving to the decision. And as I have on this slide, either after they make their decision, we either litigate or we live with it. And then I wanted to mention there's a couple of other places where the public can plug in. It's maybe not part of the official NEPA process. And that is if there's some sort of collaborative happening on the forest, some sort of collaborative process where they might be inviting people to public meetings or field trips. And that's, like I said, sort of outside of the normal NEPA process. My cats are going nuts behind me back here. But it's a great opportunity for the public to weigh in and actually get on the ground and see projects and ask questions of the agency staff. And then one last thing to note, like I said, I was going to talk fast. The important thing about all of this is that in order to get to these phases that I just circled up here, objection, protest, or litigation. So once the agency's set on what they are planning to do, we've submitted all our comments and we want to fight it. In order to take these steps, you have to have commented in some of the steps above. So you have to have commented either to the scoping process or the public comment process in order to have standing to actually move forward with these other types of challenges according to NEPA.
Thank you. That was really helpful, really thorough. We have about 1.5 minutes left with you, and I'm wondering, so there's also a lot of great questions happening in the chat. Thank you to all who are asking and answering them. One of them kind of lines up with the last question that I wanted to ask you, though, in the last minute or so. Could you just give an example of a specific timber sale that you utilized the NEPA process either successfully or unsuccessfully, something of note that you think is worth sharing?
Yeah, I tried looking through a lot of examples because we look at about 400 projects every year across Oregon. Oregon Wild does, and comments on like 200 as these processes are moving forward. And honestly, as I was looking through my database of all of these projects, it's really hard to tell where you've made a difference through the comment process, just because agencies aren't always answering you specifically like, oh, that was a really good point, we're going to drop this unit or that unit. It happens occasionally. It's really once we get to that objection or protest period where we see the changes happen. So that's kind of, a case for, you have to do the comments in order to, be able to do the objection or litigation. But honestly, we see most of the changes farther down that process. One example, and this is kind of a bad one, but you're all going to know it, is Thurston Hills. So the pedal power timber sale. So through the NEPA process and all the public comments that they received, the BLM actually changed their proposal before issuing their final timber sale decision, and reduced the number of acres and sort of reconfigured the logging that they had planned. Now that didn't mean that it made it much better, and we still protested and litigated that project. But we actually did see that they took public comment and sort of developed different alternatives and made some changes through NEPA.
Boo, Thurston Hills.
I know.
But no, that is a really good, it's a pertinent example. Also something that Dylan Plummer just dropped a link in the chat if you want to find out more about that. We'll send that info in our follow-up email too. It's definitely a timber sale we're trying to stop. But thank you, Chandra, for doing the difficult work of unpacking what the NEPA process is. I want to now transition over to introducing our second panelist, Brenna Bell, who is the policy coordinator with BARC. Brenna has over 20 years of organizing experience and an extensive background in environmental law and education. She is the co-founder of Try on Life Sustainable Community and Education Center and the mother of 2 children and many goats. Thank you, Brenna, for being here with us. I want to dig into, beginning to dig in with you, basically first, what does BARC do? I know that you're based in Mount Hood National Forest is where you focus your work. How does BARC use the NEPA process to protect public lands in your neck of the woods?
Okay. Let me just share my slideshow if I can get it to wow. Tech and I don't get along very well, as anyone who's worked with me know. For some reason. Oh wait, here we go. From beginning. Well, it's not showing you it the way I want you to see it. So hopefully in a moment it will cooperate with me. I work with BARC and we focus on Mount Hood National Forest. And one of the things we really like to do is get people out to the forest. Which is an amazing way to kind of find out what's there and use that information in the way that we do the NEPA process. Oh, I think it's about to work with a sharing screen. Bear with me. Everything's changed right now, but in the before times, we would get people out on the land, doing monthly hikes, doing ground truthing with lots of volunteers, going out and really getting in the field and understanding the differences between what the agency says on paper and what's actually going on in the forest. And one of the foundations of BARC's NEPA work is that we get out and we do ground truthing. So we get out into the forest. In this picture, we were doing a month-long road truthing blitz where we were actually going and finding all the ghost roads in Mount Hood National Forest and using that information in a major NEPA process around road decommissioning. The thing that we find, as Chandra said, you end up reading a lot of documents when you do this work, and there is an enormous discrepancy between what the agency says in its documents and what actually happens in the forest. And so we do road truthing and ground truthing, where we get out, get our volunteers out, get our staff out, and see what's there, and then use that information as the foundational bit of our NEPA comments. We like to go to every timber sale, sometimes every unit of every timber sale. And sometimes it's hard. They're getting bigger and bigger. The largest timber sale we're looking at now on Mount Hood is 12,000 acres. We did a 2-week camp out there. We did multiple trips out, but you can't get everywhere. So we try and go to the places where it seems like the best forest will be and also the most rare species, and get our ground truthers to look for things like fungus or lichen that are protected through the Northwest Forest Plan Survey and Manage. Oftentimes we find them, give that information to the Forest Service, and then they have to go back and resurvey. One moment that was really a NEPA success was recently there's this little tiny arboreal rodent called the red tree vole. It's the only mammal that's protected under survey and managed for the Northwest Forest Plan. And BARC was doing field work on a timber sale called the North Clack sale. And we learned that the Forest Service had done surveys there and found 3 voles. We're like, well, if there's 3 voles, we bet there's a lot more voles that they haven't found. So we joined forces with the Northwest Ecosystem Survey team. We got up with them in the trees and found over 50 active red tree vole nests, and each red tree vole nest legally gets a 10-acre buffer. And so because we were out there, we were doing the work, and then we used that and submitted it in with our NEPA comments, the Forest Service had to pay attention to it. They went back and redid their surveys, and we were able to drop hundreds of acres of that timber sale. I like to think that the NEPA process gets our foot in the door. Without that, there is no reason that the Forest Service has to really pay attention to us until litigation. It's the law that says the public has a right to know what's going on federal lands or any kind of federal projects and comment on it. Do they always pay attention to the comments? No. So that's one of the reasons we often end up, like Chandra was talking about, in the objection process. One of BARC's strengths is knowing the forest better than the Forest Service done it itself. This is our Forest Watch coordinator, Michael, at an objection meeting where he was schooling the Forest Service about what was actually going on in their timber sale. So that's one of the ways that BARC really engages in the NEPA process.
Wow, thank you, Brenna. It's really exciting to hear about all of the amazing field checking work that is happening in BARC's end of the woods. I know also a plug for next week's Wildchat, which is going to be Tales from the Field, and we're going to have Michael
oh, that's great.
Talking about some of the stuff that happens in the woods. So thank you for just kind of that overview. Thinking about Mount Hood specifically, what are the specific timber sales that you're seeing happening there and specific issues you're seeing where you're working in that place-based experience?
Sure, I think one of the main issues, like Chandra was saying, is this is still really timber driven. Something that a lot of people don't know is that the Forest Service exists in a space of receiving top-down targets that generate from Washington, D.C., from the national office, then to the regional office, then to the local forests. And there are volume targets that each national forest is supposed to achieve annually, and then it disperses them to the districts. And the district rangers' performance evaluations are based on whether or not they meet their volume target. That is a primary driver of the entire federal timber sale program. It's actually not money, because the national government loses money through its timber sale program every year, but it's these targets that are fairly arbitrary, as far as I can tell, and I've really tried to understand them, it's fairly arbitrarily set. It's also definitely not based on the market need. Right now we're going into a recession, and they are still going to keep planning timber sales even if they go no bid, which is what happened in 2008, 2009. So you have this top-down driver of timber volume. However, you will never hear anyone in the forest saying that. The BLM, bless them, they own it. They're like, yeah, we do timber sales for timber volume. But the Forest Service somehow only now does restoration because, as you've all learned, we're in a forest health crisis. The forests are unhealthy, they're overstocked, there hasn't been fire, there's too much fire. And the only way to solve this forest health crisis is to restore the forest, right? So this is what the Forest Service says is the driver to all of these projects. It's not volume, it's restoring the forest. So what does forest restoration look like? We have been working for years on this project called the Crystal Clear Restoration Project. And to the National Forest, restoration looks like 12,000 acres of proposed logging, of which 3,000 acres were old growth, the entire thing in spotted owl critical habitat, bringing down a very moist mixed conifer and natural forest down to 35% canopy, about half of it. It's, Mount Hood's kind of weird because we have an east side, unlike any of the other Cascade Mountain national forests. So on the east side, they use fire a lot to justify things. However, like this in the picture, and they were saying, we've got to log that down to 35% to, save it from being burned in a fire. So we're looking at an issue where, it's double speak, because we explain to a lot of our volunteers when they're starting to read things, they're like, this makes no sense. Yes, it makes no sense when you get out there and you see is this timber volume. So we're seeing that across the forest, whether it's forest health or fuels reduction. Everything is couched as restorative when it's really still to meet those timber volume targets.
So with the Crystal Clear project, in the case of something like this, you all went through the NEPA process, you submitted comments, and the timber sale went through anyways. The Forest Service pursued the sale anyways. So what happens when the NEPA process doesn't work? How did you protect the forest?
Yeah, so when the Forest Service decides not to pay attention to our NEPA comments, which is unfortunately fairly common. I mean, sometimes we can whittle things away. Like with Crystal Clear, we got, a couple acres dropped here, 100 acres dropped there, but at the end they went for it. So we went to court. This has a lot of words. Sorry. The main things about Crystal Clear is that they called it a restoration project. It was clearly driven by volume. They said it was about fire, but it was outside of all of the fire. The WUI or the Wasco County Fire Plan. It was well functioning, so we decided to sue, along with Oregon Wild and Cacsadia Wildlands. Some of our co-plaintiffs are here. And how Chandra talked about those different levels of assessment, right? They were analyzing this in an environmental assessment. It was 12,000 acres of logging in spotted owl critical habitat, much of was suitable habitat, much of which was old growth forest, the largest project we'd seen in BARC's history of 2 decades working on the forest. And they said, no significant impact, we're going to do an EA. And we're like, oh, hell no, that has a significant impact. You need to analyze this in an EIS. You need to be honest here. This is going to significantly impact it. And the main issue in that litigation was around the scientific uncertainty of whether or not logging, especially logging mature forests, actually reduced fire risk. So we went to court. And the district court we lost. And we weren't shocked because our judge used to be a lawyer for the Forest Service. And then we appealed it to the Ninth Circuit and had a really lovely discussion with the judges who understood this issue of scientific controversy that we'd brought up. Because in the NEPA comments, since scoping, since the very first time we could, we said, listen, you're saying that this logging is going to improve fire behavior, it's going to reduce fire risk. And there's an entire body of science that's contrary to that. Please engage with that body of science. And they didn't. Again, at every single step of NEPA, we said, there is this contrary body of science to your conclusions. And they refused to engage. So the judges agreed. And this is from the decision that we got in April, where the judges said, throughout the U.S. investigative process, appellants pointed out to numerous expert sources, and the Forest Service never looked at them, and it demanded that the Forest Service prepare an EIS for this sale. So they have to go back to the drawing board. Of course, they're being sore losers and are talking about asking for a rehearing on this case, but I won't dwell on that. I'll dwell on the fact that we won, and the Forest Service is real upset because they don't want to put the hard work in to do the actual environmental analysis necessary for a project of this scope. But we're saying do smaller projects that are less controversial or do an adequate analysis. Those are kind of the possible options, and we're interested to see what they do.
Thank you for that inspiring story, and thank you for all of the work that you and BARC and all of the incredible volunteers, many of who are on this call tonight. Thank you for what you all did to protect this place. I'm now going to transition us to our final panelists, and it looks like we may have some time at the end for discussion, which is awesome too. But I want to introduce Brodia Minter, who is the Conservation Associate with the Klamath Siskiyou Wildlands Center based in Ashland, Oregon. Brodia keeps the federal government accountable while incorporating conservation of wildlife and watershed values outside of just timber extraction in Southern Oregon. And she focuses a lot of her work on the intersections of logging and wildfire, which is a key issue in the region she works. So welcome, Brodia. Thank you for being here. Could we start by talking a little bit about what makes the Klamath Siskiyou region so special ecologically?
Is my screen sharing working?
Yeah.
I also am not a techie millennial,
Funny
but we're
how
gonna.
that works with us forest folks.
Yeah, it happens. Okay. So this is how it's gonna show you, I guess. Oh, present. So this photo is a photo I took on Herman Creek, not in the Klamath Siskiyou ecoregion at all. I grew up in Connecticut where there are no public lands. And if you would have asked me 10 years ago, what does a Pacific Northwest forest look like? This would have been my answer. Mossy, old growth, dripping, luscious, wet, beautiful forests. But generally, this is not what most of the forests in Klamath Siskiyou often look like. Here it is in all its glory, the Siskiyou ecoregion. It's 8.2 million acres of what is now federal public lands, most of which that has long been adapted to thrive with frequent fire events. Down in Ashland, I live in a dry Mediterranean climate where fire significantly contributes to forest diversity, and we see it as a key ecological process. But we are on indigenous land that has been evolving with fire for a way longer than since I moved here. Native peoples regularly used fire to steward this region for time and millennia until they were forcibly removed from the landscape to make room for European white settlers. I'm currently speaking on the ancestral lands of the Taloa Dene, Tequilma, Cow Creek, Umpqua, Coquille, Rogue, Shasta, Klamath, Yurok, Hoopa, and many other indigenous tribes. This is an example of what a mixed fire regime can look like. And what that means is that when fire burns across the landscape, it varies greatly with the terrain. It can affect some areas and then other areas barely at all. And weather has a lot to do with this. For example, a pretty famous fire down here in Southern Oregon is the Biscuit Fire. Some of you have probably heard of it. Some of you have probably seen its effects and fought for it. It's been about a decade and a half, I think it was 2002, since the Biscuit and the Kalmiopsis Wilderness, which I personally think is one of the most beautiful places. And I can attest for myself, I was hiking there last weekend, that in some patches of the Kalmiopsis, there are lush, beautiful, dense forests with thick canopies and rare Port Orford cedars and Darlingtonias, carnivorous plants. And then there are other portions of the Kalmiopsis that burned really hot and stand replacing. But one thing in for certain that these, large trees on my way to Pine Flat found here in the Kalmiopsis, they survived logging and they also survived many wildfires. The Klamath Siskiyou is special because so many reasons that I can't even imagine that I could list them all. And but there are a lot of serotinous species here, and serotinous species require fire to germinate. And so like the knobcone pine or a lodgepole pine needs fire to melt the wax off its pine cones for their seeds to spread. So here in the Klamath Siskiyous, the fire in forest is healthy in forest. This is another example of what fire in the Klamath Siskiyous can look like. This is, I took this photo on the Bee Camp Road in Northern California and Cooking Green Pass in Botanical area, looking into the Red Buttes Wilderness. This was a 2017 fire out of the Miller Complex, and it burned both on the Rogue River Siskiyou National Forest and the Klamath National Forest. And when you look at this photo, you may see something different than I see. I see a thriving ecosystem, but others have described this as a new. And here in Southern Oregon and Northern California, there's a long history of timber interests and public land managers capitalizing on the fear of wildfire. We often hear words as devastating or catastrophic. And the truth is that the development in the wildland-urban interface, or WUI, has created conditions where these fires that are natural to this area now threaten tens of thousands of homes and lives. And for people like me that have chosen to live in fire-prone forests or have been born here, the fear of fire is objectively legitimate. The destruction of the town in Paradise, California was real and has had serious implications for many people. However, and this is pretty important, I think while an objective fear of fire, burning down your home or harming your community is legitimate, what isn't legitimate is using that fear to push thinning or fuels reduction on any acre and every acre as a response to the community's need to feel safe. And I think this is something we see a lot of, the use of fear mongering by the timber industry to push logging as the solution. Cut down the forest.
A little more, sorry to interrupt you, but that is such a good and important point, and I'm hoping we can impact that a little more. Just like, can you talk about that? Because you just made such a beautiful case for the role of fire on the landscape where you live, and you're talking about this huge issue that we're not only seeing in Southern Oregon, but that's obviously the hot spot for this issue. Talk to us about what is happening with these logging projects proposed in the name of wildfire prevention, and why is that an issue?
So cut down the forest and then it can't burn is like a really easy message for people to understand. It's much easier than the complex nuances of the effects of fire behavior and math and flame lengths and fuels on the ground and weather that, takes a lot to understand and comprehend and use as to inform the narrative and messaging of fire. And the Forest Service and the BLM use this same narrative. And it goes back to the primary purposes of each agency and how they came to be federal land managers. And I talk a little bit, Chandra mentioned a lot of really important laws that dictate forest policy. And I think one of the things that, and Brenna also mentioned that the BLM is kind of just like, yeah, it's for our annual sale quantity. We're not scared to say it. But I think because of the way Oregon, particularly the lands that I work on down here, the Oregon-California Lands Act, and I'll give you just a 30-second overview of them, because they dictate a lot of how fire behavior has come to be in Southern Oregon, and why we see logging in the backcountry. And so just like a quick second overview of the ONC Act is that I called it the train wreck. Oregon-California Lands Act was 2.6 million acres of federal public land in Western Oregon was granted in 1869 to the Oregon and California Railroad to construct a rail between Portland and San Francisco. And they were supposed to sell the land to legitimate homesteaders, but surprise, they didn't. And the railroad began selling the land to corporate interests instead of settlers. And after all of the scandal and corruption, in the end, the forest land was taken back by the US government, by Congress in 1916, and is now managed by the BLM today after the passing of the ONC Act in 1937. And all of these checkerboards are now substantially private timber holdings. And I took a screenshot of just your area, like south of Eugene, and you can see the amount of clear cutting and industrial plantation establishment in the ONC lands is something that significantly increases fire hazard. And so if I go back a slide and you look at most of the green here is national forest, and then the orange and the red checkerboard is every other private public square. And so if all of the private squares are clear cut plantation regeneration forestry, we are significantly suffering from connectivity and issues and fragmentation. And so it's just further emphasizes how important the public lands in this area are, because we cannot count on private industrial lands to contribute any of the habitat or conservation or watershed values that we look to our public lands for. So what can we make of all of the logging projects that capitalize on the fear of wildfire and planned under wildfire prevention? I think the best way to move forward is really to get on the ground and look at what Brenna was just talking about, what the NEPA documents say, and then do those, does the analysis meet the site-specific conditions in the woods? And I think the Klamath Siskiyous are especially complex because we have such a wide range of forest habitat and types, and one size does not fit all down here. You can, go to the Kalmiopsis and then turn around and go to, the Rogue or the Cascades, the Cascade Siskiyou National Monument, and you're going to find completely different soil types, trees, botany, flower, wildlife. And so knowing the reality of what the timber documents and interests say is going to give you the best ammunition to stop these projects. And then rest your hands in science of the things we know are true. Cutting down large mature forests is the worst thing we can do for carbon sequestration. These large fire adapted ecosystems sequester the most carbon. Climate defense and forest defense go hand in hand that way. I think that managing for your home and making your home hardening or making your home fire safe is something that you can do to feel like you are contributing on those on those private lands squares to decrease fire hazards and fire risks, and asking land managers to focus on thinning of these existing densely stocked plantations that they've created for over 100 years, and focusing those plantation thinning projects on portions of BLM land that are close to the I-5 corridor or would further fire hazards near homes and communities.
Thank you, Brodia. And in the last couple minutes we have with you before we go into just general questions and a wrap up, because it's always nice to hear about victories, can you tell us of a victory that KS Wild had using the NEPA process and or litigation to save a place where you're at?
I can tell you about this one project that is not necessarily a victory yet. Well, it's a small victory, but looking forward to it to be a bigger thing. And I think I put the map on here. So, well, okay, so these are two projects planned on either sides of the Cascade Siskiyou National Monument. I don't know if you can see my mouse, but this is the Cascade Siskiyou National Monument, and this is the Cascade Siskiyou National Monument, and then these are the timber sale units, and then in pink on this side. And as you can see, when you go and ground tree these projects, the oldest, most mature trees have already been removed. As you can see, my beautiful dog is cutely modeling how big that tree would have been if we continued to grow. And then if you look, the trees in the background are, the second largest trees, and they're marked for timber harvest. And you keep walking through the unit, and the same thing continues. And so when you read the BLM documents, they admit for 5 to 20 years following so this was unit 15-2 of the Griffin Half Moon timber sale on the Indian Plateau. And it's adjacent to the monument within one of the hotspots for great gray owls. It's a source population for the California great gray owl population, and they are targeting known buffers. And this map here, the other one, the North Project, is a relative density map. And if you look at the volume of their timber units, it's green. What does green say? Higher relative density values. So they're looking for places where they can get the most volume, and they're replacing it with these densely packed tree plantations that are going to increase fire hazard. And so we filed suit with the Western Environmental Law Center and Cacsadia and Oregon Wild, both on the North Project and the Griffin Half Moon Project. The North Project currently, we also filed a 60-day notice under the Endangered Species Act telling the BLM, hey, you are in violation of the Endangered Species Act, because they plan to remove a bunch of northern spotted owl habitat, because big old trees, right? And they rescinded their decision document and provided a revised environmental assessment that we have since submitted comments on. And I think we're going to continue to engage through the NEPA process to hopefully get some of those units dropped or stop the sale in its entirety, because they didn't do the requisite environmental analysis necessary to have a timber sale of that size. The North Project was designed to continue to contribute for the annual sale quantity of the Klamath Falls resource area of the BLM for over a decade under one environmental assessment.
Wow. That is a project that definitely needs to be stopped, and I'm glad that you're putting it in the category of victory. That makes me feel good and very hopeful.
We're gonna get them.
We're gonna get it. Cool. So thank you three. That was incredibly enlightening, and in a rare twist of events, we have some time for Q&A. So let's use it. There have been a lot of good questions in the chat. I think most of them have been answered, but there was a recent one that I think maybe people want to speak a little bit more to, because it's kind of about this entire weakening of the whole NEPA process. Brenna, Chandra, do you all want to elaborate on what you put in the chat?
Sure. There are two processes going on concurrently to weaken NEPA. One is just within the Forest Service. As Chandra said at the beginning, NEPA is a statute that went through Congress, but it's primarily implemented through regulations, which the executive branch implements through executive agencies. So right now in the Trump administration, there is a directive to all agencies to get rid of as many environmental regulations as they can. So the Forest Service undertook its own process of trying to weaken its NEPA regulations, basically to decrease the amount of things that had to go through full analysis. That started last year. And then the Council for Environmental Quality, which wrote the NEPA regulations, they're both in process.
And, sorry, you froze for me, Brenna, so I didn't mean to.
You froze for me too. Maybe
oh,
you can
sorry.
Elaborate a little more on that. I think we heard the first half.
I think, so she was addressing the Forest Service's rulemaking, and then there's also this separate CEQ rulemaking. And then
the Council for
Environmental Quality, right? And someone else mentioned, you know, the Forest Service wants to increase the threshold for how many acres you can treat with CEs. And actually that's been happening consistently. And not through this big rulemaking, but sort of in a piecemeal fashion. In fact, some of that has come from Congress. So that's an important thing to note, is that Congress has been meddling in passing or sort of like tacking on changes to NEPA in bigger, you know, unrelated bills for many years, and adding different categorical exclusion categories to allow for, you know, more logging and other types of activities with that streamlined process, without the Forest Service or the BLM actually going through a, you know, a rules process. Is just, you know, Congress saying, yeah, we want things to go faster, we want more logs. And so there actually are several new-ish categories to help breeze through timber sale projects that have passed over the last 5 to 10 years, some even more recently than that. So we've already seen that, and that increase in CEs, and we're going to see more with the new rules that the agencies are doing.
Thank you for answering that. Scary definitely, and a lot of our organizations are tracking this process. So if you're following us, you can get plugged into action opportunities. I think there was a good question that just happened from Murray that might be a good last question, which is, what is the best conservationist argument to counter the argument that timber cutting provides jobs and needed timber for construction? And feel free, panelists, or if others on this call, I know a lot of folks are thinking about this right now, want to jump in, go for it.
Well, Brenna and Nick just answered that question pretty well.
That's true.
We did, but the one thing I want to increase on that, we talked about the market, but also the amount of jobs being lost right now are not because of environmental regulation. They've been two main reasons. One is you can only log old growth once. So the resource just isn't there in the same way. But the main reason in the past 10 years that we've seen job loss is because of increased mechanization of the industry. When I started as a forest activist in the 90s, there were dudes with chainsaws logging trees in the forest. And now they have all been replaced by machines. Instead of having 10 people on a work site, there are 2 people on a work site. And so increasing volume, there are graphs from the Oregon Department of I always forget their name, of employment, that show that timber volume is steadily increasing while jobs are steadily decreasing. And that's all due to mechanization and also the export of raw logs. So environmentalists often get blamed for it, but that is not the reason in this current time or market that the jobs are being lost.
And just to add on that, Brenna, I think that's one of the reasons why you see the agency pushing for regeneration harvest and clear cutting, is that it enables them to use that machinery, as opposed to more selective logging practices that might have higher benefits. It's cheaper and easier, and they can use, the industry can use the machines that they have just to come in and just bulldoze everything down.
Right, and they're also getting really creative. They're starting to do tethered machine logging on really steep slopes where they will tether a feller buncher to an anchor and dangle it off a hillside, which is something new that they've never done before. They're doing more and more focus on how to get machines in there rather than people. Yeah. But it's very convenient for the industry to blame us.
Yeah. You bring it back to NEPA too. I mean, those are the types of things that, need to be carefully analyzed and aren't. What are the impacts of those big machines that are being tethered to the top of a super steep slope? They're not addressing that in the right way. They're not, really talking about how that's going to impact wildlife or the soil. I mean, they just, even though we hold up NEPA as this amazing law where they have to do this analysis, they're not doing really doing that analysis justice, and that's why we have to resort to things like litigation and other methods to really ensure that they aren't permanently damaging, some of these forests and all the things in them that we have left.
Thank you all on that really well said note. Thank you to the 3 panelists for all of that wonderful information. Thank you everyone for being on this call. Again, it's really wonderful to see all of your faces who I see a lot of you in the movement who are contributing in various ways, and it's really good to know that we have a movement and we are using this process and winning in a lot of ways, although there's a lot of fight to be had. So I just want to make a quick plug for next week's Wildchat, which is going to be kind of in connection with this, about how to fight timber sales through field checking and on-the-ground surveying with some stories from the field. So it should be really fun with speakers from BARC, from Cacsadia Wildlands, and also from the Blue Mountain Biodiversity Project on the east side of the Cascades. Also, Cacsadia Wildlands has a really wonderful, vibrant Wildcat volunteer team that gets out into the woods and is really active in halting destructive timber sales all across the west side of the Cascades. And Dylan just threw a link to the Wildcats in the chat. If you want to get involved, it's a really beautiful community. And our Wildcat volunteer meeting is actually coming up just this Thursday. We have it once a month. It's going to be on Zoom, thanks to the COVID-19 pandemic, but it's always a great time to plug into our work, and everyone is welcome to join. I will follow up to this with a link to the recording of this video and some additional resources that were thrown in this chat. Thank you all for coming. Thanks again to our panelists. Have a good night, y'all.
And thank you, Sam. We'll miss you at Cacsadia Wildlands.
I'll be around.
I know. You're great. Bye, everyone.
Bye.